So, okay, recording in progress. Um, this talk has three very small points, and I'm hoping to get them done in 15 minutes. First, I want to talk about what nostalgia is and how it's related to fascism. How this sort of yearning, this sort of very vague sense of a forgotten past can actually create monsters. Um, and we're going to talk about specific kinds of nostalgia because I think not all kinds of nostalgia are the same. Some are more likely to end up in something like the Nazi movement or the MAGA movement or any kind of fascist movement. So, what is nostalgia? This is again a very brief summary. One of the first Western examples of nostalgia can be found in Homer's Odyssey, with Odysseus, pining for his beloved Ithaca. More modern notions, more sort of medical notions of nostalgia can be traced back to the 17th century. Johannes Hofer, who was a Swiss physician, he had a student from Bern who was so much pining for his home. He became ill, both physically and psychologically, lost weight, couldn't work. Halfway home to Bern, he fully recovered. And so Johannes Hofer said, "What is this thing?" And so he, from the Greek, he took the word nostos, which means homecoming, and algae means pain, and coined the term nostalgia. So basically, it's a kind of a combination of a pain and a desired homecoming. In general, nostalgia is understood as sort of the sense of longing, bittersweet pain, kind of certain or uncertain feeling for something that existed, for maybe a certain set of circumstances, a place, or sometimes something that didn't even exist yet. Sometimes it's funny on social media, we'll see very young people, Generation Z, talking about being nostalgic for the 80s and the 90s when they did not exist. And so I'm always curious what they think. Why are they longing for a shopping mall from the 1980s? That's always been interesting to me. Okay, two kinds of nostalgia. Svetlana Boym, who unfortunately has passed away, was a scholar at Harvard. She wrote this seminal book called The Future of Nostalgia, which sort of got off a lot of the conversations about nostalgia and what it is among scholars. She talked about two kinds, and I'm going to be using her schematic. So reflective nostalgia emphasizes the algia, the longing itself. It's the process of remembering and longing, sometimes ironically, and it has no desire to restore the past. So if you're engaged in reflective nostalgia, you're simply reflecting. You are sort of trying to figure out where you are in relation to a particular longing or a particular sense of the past. You don't want to rebuild it. Restorative nostalgia, which is what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk, emphasizes the nostos part and proposes to rebuild the lost home, to, make America great again, so to speak. That's restorative nostalgia. The desire to restore the past is fundamental. So what it wants to do is it literally wants to take a story, sometimes random narrative of the past, and to make it real. And like Boym, I'm wary of restorative nostalgia. I think it's dangerous. Like I said, I think it can breed monsters. Now, there are modern examples of collective reflective nostalgia, and I'm mostly talking about collective nostalgia here. There's also obviously individual nostalgia. So this is the reflective. This is the non-fascist one. You might have heard of Ostalgie, the play on the word nostalgia, with the German Ost meaning east. So former residents of East Germany for a long time had this longing for their sense of community in the GDR, not necessarily Stasi or the government, but the sense of togetherness, the sense of community. By the way, some of you may know this. I was actually born in the Soviet Union, and a lot of people who are Russian had the same thing. Svetlana Boym herself was an ex-Soviet citizen, and she wrote her book in part as a reflection of the sort of nostalgia feeling that a lot of refugees from the Soviet Union felt. Well, people who used to be members or citizens of East Germany felt the same thing. So East German brands and products and music, even the little car, the Trabant, that nobody ever wanted, became a collector's item, right? Because everybody wanted that. But this was not an attempt to reproduce the GDR. Nobody said let's get East Germany going again. It's basically just this reflection on where you are as somebody who is from a place that no longer exists, and what your relationship is with that past. Yugo nostalgia from the former Yugoslavia is the same thing. It was a very aesthetic kind of movement, art, music, film, where people sort of reflected on what it's like to be missing something that wasn't necessarily good, but that was at the same time, made up their lives, made up who they were. Now, modern examples of restorative nostalgia. So this is, we're of course talking about Trump, and I apologize, I don't mean to trigger anybody. We're going to talk about Trump and fascism. On the first day of the 2024 Republican National Convention, they said, make America the land of opportunity again. And I want to focus on the again. Make America wealthy once again. Make America safe again. Make America strong again. Make America great again. The again is the restorative nostalgia writ large. It's this idea that America used to be this great thing. It used to be strong. It used to be safe. It used to be wealthy. It is no more, but there's one guy that can help you get there. Right. So it's this vague and distant sense of America when things were better. And there was lots and lots of think pieces that were written. Is Trump talking about the 1950s? Is he talking about the 1850s? Both of those might be true and false at the same time. And by the way, Trump didn't invent this sort of, again, restorative nostalgia mantra. When Reagan ran in 1980, very much Morning in America, it's the same thing. Morning in America again. Jimmy Carter made America bad and bleak and dark, but Reagan will gonna make the sunrise. It's kind of the same. It's the same narrative. So in a sense, restorative nostalgia is kind of a dog whistle, right? And it's interesting. There's these also, I mean, I could talk about this a long time and I won't. This relationship to sexism and racism that people who do sort of fall for the restorative nostalgia narrative, people with more politically nostalgic leanings are 23% more likely to agree with the following statement. Irish, Italian, Jewish, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked hard. Blacks should do the same without any special favors. Also, that women are too easily offended and seek to gain power by getting control over men. So I sort of see the entire anti-DEI movement and political action as this sort of a reification of this dog whistle of, well, these people don't really deserve to be where they are. We need to put them back in their place. So restorative nostalgia really can become a kind of a xenophobia and nativism. Back in the early part of the 20th century, there was a movement called the American Boot, which basically was the American Nazi Party. And this America First movement kind of came out of there, right? It emerged out of American white nationalism. And then Pat Buchanan used it in his 2000 presidential run on the Reform Party ticket. But this idea that Americans to go back should focus on the Anglo-Saxon roots of American history. And you have to ask yourself, who does that exclude, right? There's a sort of a restorative nostalgic view of what it means to be American. America first means white men first. That's how you just read that. White men, non-immigrants first. So, and if you even doubted it, you were not a real American. You were subversive. You were an enemy of the state. And you can hear a lot of the same songs being sung now. Now, obviously, and as a Russian, I have to bring Putin in. Putin is also quite the champion of restorative nostalgia. And a lot of the verbiage surrounding the Russia's war in Ukraine very much relies on this idea of Soviet greatness, the lost Soviet greatness, and the necessity of bringing it together. In fact, a number of years ago, Putin said, to everybody's horror, that one of the worst horrors in world history was the falling apart of the Soviet Union. He said that was one of the worst things to ever happen. So he's been on this, despite what he says, he's been on this restorative quest to not just rebuild the Soviet Union, but to rebuild Russian greatness. He sort of melded those two. And he keeps pointing back, look at how powerful we were. Look at how united we were. We won the Great Patriotic War, which is World War II, which is what it's called over there. So to kind of sum up, we finally get to actual fascism, right? So there's 5 kind of moves that I think that the restorative nostalgia makes possible. First of all, it creates a kind of a sense of loss, right? A glorious past that's been ruined forever by these people who don't know what they're doing. They want to hurt you. We need to go back to a time of national greatness. The present is a crisis, period of crisis and moral decay. Back in the 1930s and 40s, the Nazis had art shows of what they called degenerate art. And through degenerate art, they were trying to say, look at how far the West has fallen. This Western civilization has fallen. What we want sort of Nazi realism, not this moral decay. The providing a solution. Fascist movements return to the lost past as a solution. The narrative is almost like the present is broken, the future is uncertain, the only certain thing is the past. And that's where we must find our strength. And this is where we get to the actual authoritarian. And only one person or one party can get you there. And that people have to be unified. We have to take inspiration from the past, bring it into the future and the present, and be united behind a person, a party, an idea. And the idea here finally is to build a community of people who don't question that. People who don't question the idea that the past always trumps the present, and that whoever gets to sorry to sort of plagiarize Orwell, but whoever determines the present determines the future. All right. And here's actually a picture from Nazi Germany as a picture of family. If you saw some of the social media posts from Trump's administration, I find a lot of pictures that very much look exactly like this. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. We'll open this up for discussion, like I said, later, although if you want to start adding comments and questions in chat, you can now. But moving right along, Emily Jones from the University of Manchester, take it away.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak today, and hello from the UK. I actually just wanted to start by actually sort of prefacing some of the nostalgia comments, because I think there's a lot in there, but I do think it's important to not see it as intrinsically a kind of like right-wing phenomena, in that, nostalgia can be found in the labor movement, anti-capitalist movement for, medieval past. It's all in socialist art in the 19th century, in the same way that, suffragettes and radicals in the 19th century in Britain would look to the ancient constitution as a way of restoring rights and arguing for rights. In a context that did not like the idea of natural rights. So I think it is just really important to think about, when we talk about nostalgia, not viewing that as intrinsically politicized or partisan, but also being really careful about where the line goes between historicism, which is just thinking with the past, which was really, really common up until about like the 1970s, and nostalgia, which is a distinct thing. And I think that, there's nothing wrong with using the past to imagine the future. In fact, I think we need to do it more. Yeah, not to try, like, as in, like, for everybody listening, like, if we're increasingly hearing this idea of nostalgia as being kind of intrinsically linked to certain ways of thinking, and that's not the case. So yeah, I just wanted to start by, as a historian, start by saying that. So Ian asked me to speak about the relationship between conservatism and fascism, and I imagine upon hearing this, you might be wondering whether conservatism even still exists, or whether conservatism is kind of simply blending into fascism at the moment. And I've decided to keep this brief, but I'm really happy to go into more details in the discussion. So I'm a historian of how ideologies kind of take shape and change meaning in different contexts, in different places, and at different times. So for me, ideas about conservatism and fascism are not these kind of timeless ideas that have existed in one form across time and space, but were shaped by human beings who were operating in specific circumstances. And the term conservative, in its kind of political meaning, first emerges in the 1830s in continental Europe, and it's applied to the Big C Conservative Party in Britain from 1834, but lots of Tories do not like that label for various reasons. The form of being a conservative isn't fixed, which might seem surprising, but it is true. And I think we now think about conservatism with a small c as kind of being this kind of neat set of ideas and beliefs about the nature of and change over time, and kind of related to the sense of the importance of specific kind of religious or political or constitutional institutions, with Edmund Burke positioned, as the fairy on top of the Christmas tree as its founding father. And in contrast, my work has shown how this understanding of conservatism was first developed in the UK at the turn of the 20th century, and then in the US kind of in the Cold War, really. And this was the work not just of conservatives or conservative thinkers, but a really broad spectrum of scholars, historians, journalists, students and teachers, from across the political spectrum. And I think really what we're talking about here is a question of boundaries. And I think what is really important to understand about conservatism as an idea is that it emerges within liberal constitutional frameworks. And by that I mean mixed representative constitutions, as opposed to, firstly, absolutism in continental Europe, and then secondly, fascism, Bolshevism, and then later, during the Cold War, totalitarianism in all its forms. And these political ideas were developed relationally, they weren't developed in a vacuum. So in Britain, the Conservative Party in the interwar period and beyond defines itself against both the socialism of the Labour Party at home, but also Bolshevism and then the Soviet Union, but also as against manifestations of fascism, both at home in the form of Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, and also on the continent, so Mussolini's Italian fascism, as well as German Nazism. So these movements were described by British conservatives and by the British Conservative Party as fundamentally alien to British values and to British constitutional and political traditions. So if we're thinking about boundaries, that kind of idea about conservatism existing in that particular constitutional framework is really, really important. So conservatism, like fascism, is a relational term that doesn't just capture ideas, but it's about actions, it's about practices, and it's about politics. And they're traditions that live through remaking and remodeling. Nonetheless, while there might be multiple meanings or understandings of conservatism that change kind of in time and space, the term itself is not just an empty vacuum that you can pour any idea into. And I think thinking about those boundaries is actually what, again, is really key here. And this is where the point about how historically speaking there were many conservatives with a big C who might have become interested in what we call fascist or now kind of hard right ideas. But it is really important to understand that conservatism was always kind of fundamentally constitutionalist rather than a rejectionist force. And conservatism, like all isms, was constructed, it was reimagined, it was popularized, by all kinds of people, not just, and this is really important, not just by conservatives or by conservative thinkers. It was a product of the acceptance of liberal, i.e. non-absolutist or totalitarian frameworks, but there still remains, I think, a problem today. So in 1955, T.S. Eliot addressed the London Conservative Union and asked his audience to consider what is the literature of conservatism. And Eliot understood that the task of conservatives in every generation was to rethink what the literature of conservatism is and what it means to be a conservative, in kind of, in recent times. And yeah, I think that conservatives from the end of the Cold War have really struggled to reimagine who they are and what conservatism means. Who are the opponents of conservatives? Won't get these kind of, inventions of woke history and Brexit and all of these other things. They're kind of sticking plasters because who is the bogey? But also, kind of, what does it mean to be a conservative in a more positive sense? Is that being articulated in the same way that it used to be? And specifically, if we're thinking about opponents in a British context, for me, Tony Blair's New Labour adopted what was a historically conservative kind of terminology, which included things like equality of opportunity, and kind of once derogatory terms such as meritocracy, and this and kind of through this kind of argument around modernisation, which kind of tempers again this kind of sense of an opposition even further. The Labour Party today, as you might be aware, has very few big ideas beyond delivering, fixing, nudging, and this kind of like dearth of ideas seems to not just be an issue with mainstream conservatism, but with the Labour Party too, and maybe this is true for Democrats as well, but I don't know about that as much. I think that things like opposition, as I said, opposition to the EU and other things has kind of provided a sticking plaster. But clearly, if you are aware of our recent election results, it's not held. And I think this matters because over the past decade, historians, political scientists, political commentators have observed that the stability of mass democracy since the end of the 19th century has in some sense relied on the presence of a strong mainstream conservative party, under whatever name you might want to call it. And if we're thinking about, I don't know, combating fascism or whatever it is that we want to do, is there a need to conserve conservatism, or whatever you want to call it? And I think it really is important to understand that this isn't just the work of conservatives or the work of elite thinkers. So I wanted to conclude on a positive note. So my work has shown that a really wide range of contributors and of audiences have constructed to some of our major political traditions, so Burkean conservatism being one of them. But I think I love being a historian because I think history really does demonstrate that nothing is inevitable, that human agency matters, and that everyone can do this kind of reconstructive work. We don't have to wait for the next political thinker, but we really do need to think about who controls the narrative and how we can help to shape it. So yeah, keep.
Thank you so much. Moving right along. Mark Lance, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I was a philosopher officially for, I don't know, 40 years or so. I retired a little over a year ago. All through that time, I was also an organizer and activist. And what I got to say today is really wearing the organizer and activist hat, speaking to philosophers, if that's okay. So I'm not going to actually do any philosophy here. I'm going to just talk about what I think philosophers can and should be doing, both in general and at this moment in time. So very quickly, I think philosophy has a great deal to contribute to understanding and resisting fascism. I'm a philosopher of language. I would mention things like Lynn Terrell's work on toxic speech, Jason Stanley on propaganda. Quil Kukla and I are currently writing a paper on systematic ways that speech is weaponized. In epistemology, there's a number of, I think, fairly deep questions about exclusion and how people are deceived into working against their own interests, questions around expertise. Both too much trust of experts and too little trust of experts can play into authoritarianism. Stated that vaguely, I think that's clear, but it would be great to see some interesting work on that. And then, of course, in political philosophy, you have questions like how do authoritarian systems of different sorts relate, develop, and interact? What keeps them in place? How can they be defeated? What are the different forms of oppression and control? And what opportunities for organization, solidarity, and resistance arise in each of those? We might think about whether certain technological innovations are conducive to or resistant to fascist control, or how economic stratification contributes to authoritarianism. You know, all of these are things that philosophers think about and could certainly think about more. I don't think any of them are easy questions. None reduce straightforwardly to other disciplinary questions. For the most part, social science and sometimes natural science is certainly relevant to all these questions. But I think there are ways in which the broader view of a philosopher can importantly contribute as well. All that said, I think the answer to the question of what philosophers, qua philosophers, should be contributing to resisting fascism at the current moment is roughly nothing. I know that may sound contentious to folks, but I believe it fairly strongly. If I'm trapped along with my family in a burning house, and my next door neighbor, who's a research chemist, yells over to tell me about a project on flame-resistant insulation, I'm going to find that rather unhelpful. I would much prefer a ladder to the upstairs window or a phone call to the fire department. Our collective house, in my opinion, is burning. Longtime US institutions, both formal institutions in government and elsewhere, and implicit practice upon which the functioning of institutions depend, are being dismantled at a prodigious rate. The most humane elements of the government, those that, in my view, offer bandages and opiates for the suffering endemic to capitalism and imperialism, and are not unimportant for that reason, are either fully dismantled already or very close to it. ICE, which is essentially the president's private army at this point, has a budget higher than the military budget of most industrialized countries, has occupied numerous cities, is snatching people off the street with impunity. Open and massive corruption is rampant. The US has allied itself with authoritarian leaders worldwide and funded and politically protected a genocide. An invasion of Venezuela appears easily potential. Universities are dismantling even the pretense of diversity, equity, or academic freedom, arresting students for protesting genocide, and paying open bribes to the regime. It's an open question whether we've seen the last fair election in US history. I take it a lot of that is obvious and familiar, but I wanted to just run through a quick little checklist of things, because I think in a moment like that, we simply don't have time for philosophical reflection on big questions. We need all hands on deck. Different people have different hands, different skills to contribute. I certainly have different ones at the age of 66 than I had at the age of 36. But I think philosophers in general have important skills to contribute, and I want to just run through those briefly, if that's all right. Obviously, one site of struggle is universities themselves. Just as the current rush toward fascism in our broader society builds upon many decades of increased policing and prisons, massive wealth concentration, increased government surveillance, falling unionization, and increasing militarization, just as the Trump phenomenon comes out of all of that that's been around, at least since this building, since at least the late 70s, in the case of universities, it builds upon decades of state defunding, replacement of faculty governance with corporate leadership, growing power of wealthy donors, increased surveillance and attacks on student and faculty speech, and the massive growth, of course, of a precarious class of teachers, sort of the undocumented workers of the academic world. They play, actually, I think, very similar roles. And for that reason, I don't think either the university, fighting for the university or fighting for the broader society can be responded to, can be carried out simply by trying to roll things back to 2024. That would be like putting out the fire in my house while leaving a giant pool of gasoline in the basement. The fire will return. We need far more radical responses, both at the university and in the broader society. And I really don't think there are a lot of options there. At the university level, in my view, and I'm happy to talk about this, I know I'm just throwing conclusions out there without any kind of detailed argument. I think we need not only unions in all of our institutions, but kind of IWW-like unions. That is to say, unions whose primary demand is not simply working conditions or wages or something like that, but worker control. We need to fight for faculty and student control of these institutions, because without it, gains are always temporary. And the entrenched forces, both the corporatized bureaucracies that run most universities, but in some sense, even more deeply, the wealthy donors that fund universities now that the states have stopped doing that, are always going to be there and are always going to have ways to roll back marginal gains unless we take control of the institution. So that's one obvious place that academics in general, in my view, could be working. Not to say that any of this is easy. Other things we're good at: writing, strategic thinking, mobilizing through public speaking, some of us anyway, forming alliances and organizations with colleagues here and abroad. Just to mention one group I work with that's expanded by a factor of about 100 in the last year and a half, Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine. For 25 years at Georgetown, there were exactly 2 faculty members who were willing to show up for any kind of a protest of anything related to Palestine. Georgetown now has about 100 faculty who are actively involved, holding monthly demonstrations, doing things like risking arrest to protect students. That's just one example. There's many of those, but building those organizational structures with colleagues around whatever the issue is strikes me as an essential way to build our power. I think at certain points we have to put our high prestige, high privilege bodies on the line when there are occupations and civil disobedience actions. And also very specifically in protection of our students. Back, in the spring of last year, when the campus occupations were happening around Palestine, around the genocide, there was a counter protest of Zionists and various white supremacist groups organized in DC that was planning to march on the encampment at GW. We got together about 150 to 200 faculty who formed a line with the simple intent that they had to march through us first. There was a lot of press there. It would have looked very, very impactful had they attacked a group of faculty. In the end, they backed off and didn't. Who knows what would have happened if we hadn't been there? But I just throw that out as a little example of the kinds of things. We have an enormous amount of prestige in this world, a lot more than some, non-citizen Arab student sitting in a tent at GW campus. And if we care about our students and we care about fighting fascism, I think we have to put our bodies out there at times. Many of us are quite able to engage with the press. In my experience, with all sorts of issues, the international press is very much looking for voices that will challenge the dominant narrative in this country. I was doing an interview for a full hour with Middle East press about the election of Mamdani and the role of grassroots organizations in building support for him and his political programs and things of that sort. These things, go over well. We need to be out there doing that. And we also, I think, need to teach our students how to do all these things effectively. I know there's a lot of people, I know a lot of the people on this Zoom here, and many of you have really contributed to all these things in important ways. But I think we all need to think really hard about what our role is at a point in history where this representative democracy thing could just fall down. And we need to think about how we want to be remembered historically, of which side of that we were on, because everyone here have the ability to contribute in important ways. The last thing I'll say is that we need to do that without necessarily putting ourselves at the center. So when I say things like, I want us to use these great intellectual skills we have, I don't mean we need to show up and start telling grassroots organizations how to do things, or telling oppressed minorities how they should be running things. That's really, really not our place. I also work with a group called Free DC that was formed right after Trump was elected to, well, protect the city against various things. It's a pretty amazing group. I mean, I don't think it's perfect. Various political decisions aren't the ones I would make, but they've grown to around 20,000 people in the last year. They do public education, they do lobbying, they do civil disobedience, they do, general informational work. I'm at a stage of my life where I can't do as much work out on the street as I used to be able to, but I spend a fair bit of time doing data entry. I take those handwritten sheets that people signed up for the organization and I put them into a spreadsheet. That's really tedious and boring and doesn't sound sexy at all. But if you don't have a spreadsheet of the people in the organization, you can't get in touch with them. And we all know how to do that. And I think I just throw that out as an example of a kind of behind the scenes thing. They've also asked me to do some workshops on civil resistance and the history of social movements. So if they ask, I'll do that. But anyway, I will stop there and just say, folks, it's fucking scary right now. I don't know what kind of world our children are going to have. And I really, really hope that they can at least say that the academics were on the right side of the fight. Thank you.
Thank you. So if people want to add questions, there's a lively discussion going on in chat, but if people want to add questions, go for it. For starters, I wanted to ask the panelists whether you had any questions or comments for one another.
I guess I just wanted to add to what Mark was just saying, in that, like, I feel that, like, over the past few months, I've been really trying to kind of like understand like where the political imagination has gone, and trying to kind of like work out the relationship actually of a kind of like declining sense of like historical imagination, also as a kind of like, the people that I look at really use the past in quite creative and constructive ways to imagine alternative futures, and not just like fascist ones, and kind of thinking about how that was actually a kind of, something that people did across the spectrum, and kind of like were able to kind of, use the past to, reinvent themselves and think about what they wanted to do in the future. And I've been kind of recently been kind of designing projects that work more with like local groups and like kind of community groups and things like that, to really and kind of policy stakeholders, because I've just been like really distressed by how social science, how abstract social science is, and how they're kind of like supposedly like better positioned to be informing policy. So yeah, I've been trying to kind of design some projects that are just more kind of outward facing, that is about kind of actually thinking not just as history as something that like is data or evidence for policy, for example, but actually history and thinking historically is a particular method. We ask specific questions, we ask different questions to people in other disciplines, and that one of the skills that we bring is imagination, like the actual ability to be able to think sympathetically and creatively about worlds and peoples who are fundamentally completely different to your own, is, I think, a very wanted skill at the moment. So I think that there are ways in which we can, you know, as Mark did, like we can bring some of those skills into the public in different ways.
Yeah, that the history of resistance, for lack of a better word, is incredibly important and generally hidden from the public. And I think it's really important for people to know about. The first semester after I retired, my colleague joked that I had the same teaching load that I had while teaching. I just wasn't getting paid. But one of the online courses I did came out of my work with the program on Justice and Peace at Georgetown. And we basically each week looked at a social movement that accomplished things. And it was amazing. And we had like 75 people in the group. It was online. And almost to a person, they said that they had no idea that of the vast majority of these. People have heard of the civil rights movement, usually a caricatured version of it. But, you know, we took apart what ACT UP did, for example, in the 80s and 90s. And, you know, I think historians showing people that we have changed things in the past, that we have defeated things and won, is enormously important for building hope and making people think there's a point to doing stuff.
I'll give myself a question if that's all right. I think this is primarily for Anna, although anyone is free to answer this. I think I'm not the first person to point out that like liberals and leftists, at least in the US in 2025, suffer from a dearth of like positive affect. Like there's nothing in politics to feel good about. And nostalgia is, yeah, it's bittersweet, but it is something that's, I think, intrinsically appealing to people. It's a feeling people like having at some level. I wonder whether your thinking about this gives you any sense of like what kind of positive affect we might want to cultivate in political spaces or in political movements right now, given that like, yeah, we're sort of on the back foot. I mean, you know, there's been a lot of losing in the last, you know, well, at least in the last couple of years, maybe in the last, you know, 100 years or so. Yeah, I don't know. Does your work give you any guidance about like what conducive positive affect might look like here?
Yeah. God, this is kind of a long answer. I'm gonna try and make it short. So there's, you know, when Boehm talks about reflective nostalgia, there's a sense of irony and contingency and perhaps even solidarity in there somewhere. The idea that we are all located where we are by accident, and that our past is as much of an accident as our future and our present. So I think one of the things, you know, people talk about how in politics, both compassion and empathy are kind of dead on both sides, right? So I think one way to get at that is to maybe channel this notion of an understanding of each other's contingency and therefore vulnerability. So I think that you know, yeah, I mean, I talked about nostalgia, the bad kind, the Nazi nostalgia, right? But there's also this other one that's really full of the sort of longing and this idea that I'm not quite certain who I am because of my past, and maybe you aren't either. And maybe the fact that neither one of us can be so certain about ourselves gives us an in to feel something for each other other than antipathy or hatred. So I mean, so maybe this is one way to look at it. This is one way to sort of look at nostalgia as a way to engender conversation. I mean, I hope Emily, I hope you didn't think that I'm thinking the past is bad. I think the past is an amazing resource of who we are and who we might be. I just think that particular ways of looking at the past are horrible and have had very bad results. Ian, I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah,
Okay.
both the reflective nostalgia bit and sort of like cultivating positive affect around like uncertainty and vulnerability and relationships with other people. That sounds right to me. Um, yeah. Here we've got a question in chat. I'll just read it out loud. Roger writes, liberalism depends upon a conception of the human being as wholly outside space, time, and causality, the intuitional fabric of being. I think the question is liberalism pure fantasy? Is liberalism cowardice in the sense that it's predicated upon a failure to take responsibility for the basic facts of existence and history? If the left can't answer this question seriously and honestly, the cycles of birth, death, and rebirth, or liberalism, totalitarianism, and liberalism, the dialectic of history, will never cease. Yeah, I think this is a question for all three of you. But is there any way to break out of this dialectic? And if there is it consistent with liberalism?
I don't really understand the question. I
Yeah.
don't, I mean, liberalism is one of those words like conservatism that's used in a whole lot of different ways these days. I don't understand how any of them depend upon a conception of the human being as wholly outside space, time, and causality. I certainly think this was the very briefly put point that there's a huge infrastructure behind the current fascism, and we shouldn't simply focus on what's going on with Trump. I certainly think we need to challenge what I would call many liberal institutions. Hell, I'm an anti-capitalist, so let's go at it. I don't think mere reform is going to pull us out of the spiral we've been in for a very long time, most of my lifetime. So I'm all for building something new, and sort of the 101 point of organizing is you both show people or work with people to solve immediate day-to-day problems, whether it be protecting them from ICE or protecting trans folks or stopping a war or whatever, while building in a conception of popular power and capacity that allows them to move toward more radical and systemic change. If you don't have the former, people go home and deal with their problems. If you don't have the latter, you're just, yeah, I agree, in a cycle of improvement and destruction.
Great. Chris writes here, I interpret fascism as primarily a future-oriented and techno-oriented movement with roots in futurism. Nazis invented interstates and meth, after all. I think there may be something to the nostalgia piece, but it is highly incomplete. Stalinism, Maoism, and Nazism have a lot in common in certain respects, in sharing visions of perfectibility through violence.
Can I take that one?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly wanted to invent the future, but the way they invent the future is by turning to the past. So you see, even on posters, Nazi posters, old Soviet posters, you will see, pictures of what looks like bullet trains, and in the back you'll see women with the kerchiefs harvesting. Right. So that's a really kind of a traditional thing. So yes, they want to move into the future, but the sort of the norms and the values and the sort of political commitments are very much rooted in the past. They just want to make them more technologically advanced. So you have like you have a technological you have a technological society with the thought patterns of something like from the 18th century. So yeah.
Jason writes in chat, I find calling anyone today a fascist a problem that doesn't allow for any progress in politics. I think I'll take the liberty of elaborating on that a little bit. I think sometimes people think that like using the word fascism just sort of makes people come off as unhinged or exaggerating the political problems of the time. And I guess there's a question of like, I guess there are two questions here. One is like, why is it not unhinged? Why is it not an exaggeration? And then I guess there's also a sort of rhetorical question of like, well, if this is a sort of rhetorical risk that you run by using the word fascism, then how do you like mitigate against that risk? Like, how do you not come off as like, oh well, these people are just, everything is turned up to 11, but it's always been turned up to 11. It's just more of the same. They said the same about Bush. They said the same about blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I guess, yeah, how do you respond to these sort of questions about the aptness of the term, or the non-exaggeratedness of the term on the one hand, and then the sort of rhetorical consequences of the term on the other?
Well, I use the term a lot. The first part of the question, the question of its pragmatic utility depends on who you think you're talking to. I'm not trying to convince the Trump regime or hardcore advocates of the Trump regime to change their ways, because I don't believe that they will listen to me in good faith and that we will have any kind of a conversation that's worth engaging into. I think social change happens because large numbers of people are organized and mobilized and employ the power that they have against the powers of governments and billionaires and armies and things. As for honesty about it, look, I mean, we can draw lines wherever we want to. We can draw the line narrowly enough such that all and only Nazi Germany counts as fascist. But, fascism is characterized by corporate control of the economy. We have a massive increase in centralization and corporatization of our economy over the last 20 years. That's, again, started earlier. It's characterized by militarism. We have America spends nearly as much on its military as the entire rest of the world combined, and as much on ICE alone as the majority of industrialized countries do on their entire military. It involves a narrow conception of the pure folk. This is, I take it, obvious in the rhetoric of the Trump regime, especially people like Stephen Miller. We're being told that the only refugees we're going to allow in are white South Africans and possibly a few fascist Germans who are being oppressed because they have laws against calling for fascism. It's characterized by a centralization of all aspects of government under the executive, which is perfectly obviously happening at an utterly prodigious rate, at the demonization of minorities, alternatives. Look at the discourse around Mamdani, who's by European standards a kind of, social democrat, calling for modest proposals. He's a lunatic communist who's going to kill all the Jews in New York, according to Republican rhetoric. Trump is firing people who disagree with him. He is pardoning every person who is a personal friend, regardless of what they've done. So there's a massive takeover of the courts, civil society. The U.S. had a thing called the U.S. Institute of Peace. It was just shut down in a day, probably totally illegally. So I'm trying to, I don't understand what aspect of fascism, classical fascism, isn't either already established in this country or rapidly on the way to its establishment. So I think it's honest. I don't care about convincing those people. I want to mobilize the people that aren't doing anything, the people that are decent, have some sympathy for other people, as Anna was saying, but are not yet active and don't see how to resist all of this. And I think the word is useful for that project.
I actually agree with Mark. I think you're totally right on. To Jason, I just want to say that, sometimes in medicine, you don't want to hear a diagnosis either because it's a crappy diagnosis and you don't want to know. And I think sometimes we can only fix a problem if we actually name it. And I think if we say that, what we do have is actual fascism, then progress can be made, because the first thing you do is you acknowledge the problem, you acknowledge the disease. Otherwise, you're just kind of just poking around in the dark.
Great. Hilmi writes in chat, on the whole, it seems to me that it's all in the narrative, positioning in space-time, positioning the group, positioning on a moral scale. Don't we need to understand what's at the root of these nostalgic narratives that have taken over if we're to counteract them? What needs do these nostalgic, conservative, or totalitarian narratives fulfill? And how can we address them in alternative ways that would still fit the moral and emotional frames they're clearly very effectively employing?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, I think I really like this comment. I think that it's right, and it's about kind of like asking those questions about how, what, why, when, these kind of like historical questions to understand causation and, kind of like reasons for why ideas are becoming powerful. This is what intellectual historians do, and this is why I really like, kind of, I guess part of my work is kind of reception history of Burke, of Disraeli, of these figures and how they're used. But it's really about how certain ideas become powerful in certain concepts. And I think that intellectual historians, this is exactly the kind of work that we do. So it might be that political scientists are asking some of these questions as well and doing many surveys. But I think there are other methods at which we can kind of, maybe we can apply these skills to thinking about kind of like modern, I stopped my book at 1990, and that felt like extremely contemporary. So yeah, I guess like thinking about how we can apply these kind of analyses that we do in our in our work to thinking about where these problems have come from, as opposed to just leaving it to people on podcasts who are really annoying. Yeah.
Can I ask Anna a question really quickly? A lot of fascist nostalgia is based on a past that didn't exist, right? I mean, a lot of it is just made up stories that the slightest actual history would say, no, we were never that. Do you have a sense of how that works, or why that's useful for the building of authoritarian institutions, to postulate a fairy story in the past and then demand that we redeem it, as opposed to, say, putting it in utopian terms, say we ought to have this fairy story?
And I want Emily to check me here if I'm getting something historically wrong, but it seems to me that some of the worst authoritarian regimes have come at a time when a population was kind of at a low point. I mean, so I think it's very good to hear that we were once great. And the reason we're not great is those people over there. Like name your, immigrant, African American, Jew, whoever, right? Those people over there. And I think that for some reason, and I'm not a psychologist, I don't know what mechanism in the human brain makes so many people susceptible to hearing these stories about past greatness, current horror, and future success. But that usually seems to be the pattern. And I think it's almost a kind of a counterfactual, kind of counter narrative kind of thinking to talk about what you're talking about, which is the opposite of assuming that the past was great and the present is horrible, or not to make those kinds of assumptions about the other. Right. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, but there just seems to be so much historical evidence for people falling for these stories. I mean, this is happening in Russia right now. Day after day, they're hearing stories of Russian and Soviet greatness. There's a word in Russian, bogatyr, and it sort of means like a big, mighty He-Man kind of thing, right? And one of the stories is the Russian bogatyr was defeated by these tiny little Western men who basically just mobbed him and took him down. And it's time for him to rise again. So I don't know. Why do people fall for that? Ask a psychologist.
Partly it's just storytelling though, isn't it? It's kind of something, it's kind of like myths are a kind of way of talking about who we are, where we've come from, where we want to go. So every political tradition has myths. Like they're not intrinsically conservative or socialist or fascist or whatever. It's that it's about myths are a kind of narrative that people tell about themselves and kind of who they were and who they want to be. So I think that they really tap into ideas about identity and kind of community and all kinds of things. So they kind of build a sense of, you know, belonging in people, I think. And I think that's partly where some of the emotional appeal comes from. Yeah, as well as kind of offering a sort of, I guess, like a logic for why we've done things and why we want to do these things in more practical terms as well. That's how I kind of I see it, and that's kind of where the power comes from, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I mean, I think people want to make sense of why they are where they are. And you tell a story that puts things in a sort of coherent order and like, oh, it must be that way. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Right. Will has his hand raised. Will, take it away.
Yeah. Hi. I just, to put in something contemporary here. You know, um, on paper, a company, a corporation, or an organization or an institution, they say that everyone has a chance, right? But in practice, decisions get made in small, quiet rooms where very few people, sit at the table. The people who approve budgets and approve promotions and contracts are often the ones who already share a certain background or a heritage. They decide who is invited into those rooms. They get to decide who gets described as a leader or a manager, and who's quietly described as the source of the problem, the troublemaker. Now, add money to that picture. The same decision makers control which projects turn into big contracts and which stay small contracts. They choose which salesperson or consultant gets the warm introductions and which one is left cold out in the dark. And then they give speeches about equal opportunity while their private choices line up again and again in favor of just one type of person. I think that is hypocrisy in motion. It's prevalent. So a question to sit with, when you look at any place where serious money, and money is the issue here, where serious money moves, who exactly signs off on the last step? How similar do they look and sound to each other? Because there's another layer that people rarely talk about. That quiet language of money. No one says outright that one group is favored and another is disposable, right? Instead, they send signals through numbers. Okay, what one person gets $1 million contract and a high commission rate, another person with the same skill and the same effort keeps getting two small accounts that barely cover their expenses. Officially, it is about performance or culture fit, but unofficially, it is about identity and loyalty to that secret inner circle. I think this is how a lie stays alive without anyone saying the ugly words out loud. The lie is that the system is neutral. The reality is that the system is designed to keep one heritage close to power and to keep others outside the circle. People who benefit will swear that everything is fair. You know, everything is fair. There's no evil in the world. They repeat that story so often that they convince themselves, even themselves, that is a comfortable hypocrisy of privilege, right? So another question. I mean, if we pulled every contract and every promotion record for the last 10 years in your workplace, in your corporation, in your organization, in your institution, what patterns would you see if you removed all names and only left numbers and background data.
Thank you, Will.
Ian, do you want to take that apart a little bit?
Yeah. I guess part of the question here is about like whether you see, like Will does, a kind of veneer of meritocracy as justifying the current, ruling order. And if you do, then what do you do sort of like rhetorically or materially to like get remove that veneer, to like get people to see, the sort of membership in the ruling class or something as not determined by merit?
But the idea of meritocracy, when it was first developed in the 60s by Michael Young, was satirical. Like, it was a joke. Like, it was like, imagine if this thing comes to be, because wouldn't that be ridiculous? And then like New Labour and various kind of like, people on the like centre left in the late 90s and noughties reinterpreted meritocracy as like a good thing, and then took on, because they wanted to distance themselves from this reconstructed old Labour, kind of old view of socialism, adopted all of these terms which were previously like conservative terms, like equality of opportunity, or reinvented meritocracy as like a positive thing. So we think these terms are like deeply embedded, but they're actually like quite recent, like parts of our vocabulary and the way we think about things, and like we don't have to stick with them. But also I think that on the funding thing, I think that is very interesting, because I have a PhD student who is currently looking at think tank funding around free enterprise in Britain after the Second World War. And so he's looking at like the Institute for Economic Affairs, the Centre for Policy Studies, some of the records at which are in the States for, many British historians. You have many archives of ours that like we have to travel to California to see them and whatever. But anyway, this I think because there is more of a culture of lobbying and kind of open lobbying in the States, I think it's even worse in places like Britain, where it's really hushed up. So like trying to find who donors are and where the money comes from and things like that, it's kind of these questions are really important, because the donors very much kind of shape, for example, the direction that think tanks go into. The think tanks kind of have these changing relationships with political parties, particularly the Conservative Party. And, there is this kind of relationship of like, sometimes do we think about ideas and we think about narratives and things like that, but sometimes I think we do need to think about money as well. So yeah, we're working on it.
Good. Well, I think we've got time for one more quick question. I said we would wrap up at 3:50 or whatever it is, 4:15 Eastern time. So George, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this discussion. Two things I want to make a point of, and I wrote in the chat. My understanding of the Nazis was they were not actually big on questions of nostalgia. I mean, Himmler, interestingly enough, had an interest in the notion of the mythic past, but Hitler himself had no real interest in that. So my point is that there's no real parallel to make Germany great again under the Nazis. What I'll say about the Nazis, and as a movement and catastrophe to learn from that has a lot of pertinence today, is this weaponization of hate. So we have to differentiate between authoritarianism and Nazism. Now, Nazism is certainly authoritarianism, but not all authoritarianism is Nazi. So the Nazis, again, were mobilizing hate, right? They were seeking to work up the public in a way to attack the Soviet Union, mobilizing people against Jews, again, deflecting from the Depression and the dire economic circumstances Germany found itself in as a result, or Germany found itself in as a result of the Depression. And so, this is where we could see the clearest, most unambiguous parallel between Hitler and a figure like Donald Trump, who tries to mobilize hate against the undocumented in particular. Trump does say things that are anti-Semitic, when he speaks of Jews as a group, for instance. And so, what I'll say is that, this is a very conscious weaponizing of hate, right? To mobilize, to deflect, to carry out whatever political project, with the Germans, with the Nazis, it was attacking the Soviet Union. Trump is trying to weaponize hate as a way to mobilize the public against China. And of course, this all is a very authoritarian politics, because dissent gets in the way of public unity, right? So the fascists will say, we need to be unified to confront our enemies. And again, this is something that Trump is also trying to do. We need to be unified. The universities need to fall in line. Critics, again, need to be deported or otherwise persecuted. So, Nazism is not something of Nazi Germany. It is a broader politics that is reflected in contemporary period as a result of the instability of global capitalism, of the fact that you have a global economic system that is divided vis-a-vis nation states. And so, in essence, there can only be one hegemon. Again, in terms of contemporary politics, Nazism, hate mongering, etc., is very much at the center of our politics. Going back to anti-communism, for instance, the 50s and 60s, leading up to what can reasonably be described of the genocide that occurred with regard to the Vietnam War. Thank you very much for allowing me my extended comments. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Well, you know what? Tell you what, because it's 2:14 Mountain Time right now. I think we might actually wrap up there. That makes it an hour and 15 minutes. Thank you so much to Anna, Emily, and Mark for doing this. We've recorded the event. I don't know if the recording will live online or maybe it'll live in print somewhere. As I've added into chat, if you're interested in finding out more stuff about the Public Philosophy Network, you can check out our website, our mailing list, or our Facebook group. We've got, if you've got ideas for future PPN events, either events for public philosophers, the resources that would be useful to people doing philosophy outreach, or events for a general audience, send me an email. That's my email is myname@gmail. Yeah, why don't we wrap it up there? Again, thank you so much. Next time, pro-fascism. Okay, yeah, I'll do my best to find the speakers. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, James.